Welcome to part 8 of my end times study. I'm Jennifer Miller, and we've been walking through all of the prophecies that relate to the end of days and Jesus's return. We've started all the way back in Daniel, looking at Old Testament prophecy that Jesus himself cited when he talked about his second coming in the Olivet Discourse. So now we have been in Revelation for a few lessons, and today the sole focus is going to be the seven trumpets. Now, it is very possible, perhaps even likely, that all seven trumpets are future events that have not transpired yet. But if that's the case, then I don't have much to offer other than just reading the verses to you that describe what they are. Because if they haven't happened yet, it actually makes it quite difficult to interpret what they could be representing and what could be happening in the future. So instead, what I want to share with you in this lesson is the theory, the hypothesis that the first five trumpets have already blown, and what we're currently waiting on is the sixth trumpet. So I'm going to walk you through evidence that I have found quite compelling as I have studied this myself, as well as listened to the theories and the ideas of others who have dedicated their lives and their careers to understanding the end times and understanding the prophecies, specifically the events in Revelation. So I hope that you find this interesting. I hope that you end up finding something worthwhile, because everything that I'm going to share, I want you to hold with loose hands. Everything could be absolutely correct. I could be right in what I'm disclosing as far as the first five trumpets, and we are just waiting on the sixth trumpet, or I could be completely wrong, or I could be partially wrong. Okay, so I'm not putting out there a concrete claim. I am just sharing with you some interesting ideas, some interesting theories that I think is quite compelling. The purpose of this is that we are awake and ready, just like Jesus said, just like Paul reminded us, just like John reminds us in the book of Revelation. We are not supposed to be caught off guard by the events that are to come. We are supposed to be like the five virgins who have enough oil to make it until the bridegroom arrives. So that's the purpose of this entire series, is to help the bride be ready for the groom's second coming, but also to encourage us, to motivate us to stay on purpose, that we are supposed to be acting as the hands, the feet, the mouthpiece of Jesus, spreading the good news, bringing people to Christ, discipling them so that they too are awake and ready for his return. So I believe understanding these trumpets, especially if I'm correct and that they have already blown, gives us insight into the sixth trumpet, which I believe is the next one to blow. However, if I'm wrong, okay, then all seven trumpets still are yet to be blown. But the things I'm sharing with you today, I think can also still be useful because, as we've already talked about, history keeps repeating itself. It is a cycle. We keep going through iterations of Nimrod rising, but because it's not yet time, God putting him down until the final iteration. So if we're not in the final iteration, I believe we're very close to it. And that the events that I believe are the final five, or are the five trumpets that have already blown, if I'm incorrect, then that means that there are still events to come that could very well seem similar or correspond to the five events I'm going to share with you. So again, if I'm right, then we're waiting for the sixth trumpet. If I'm wrong, it still gives us insight into what those events could be in a future cycle, in a future iteration. Okay. So again, this is not concrete. I am not putting it out there saying it's absolutely right and true, but I believe it's quite compelling, and I still believe it's useful, and I hope that you find that to be accurate as well. So what we're going to be starting with is actually the third trumpet, okay? And I'm going to explain why. We're going to start with the third trumpet because that's where my journey into unlocking the symbolism of the first five trumpets began. So if you're going to follow along in your Bibles, we're going to be in Revelation chapter 8. So there's two verses that describe the third trumpet, verses 10 and 11 in Revelation chapter 8. The third angel blew his trumpet. There we go. The third angel blew his trumpet, and a great star fell from heaven, blazing like a torch, and it fell on a third of the rivers and on the springs of water. The name of the star is Wormwood. A third of the waters became wormwood, and many people died from the water because it had been made bitter. Okay. So let me tell you the story that is related to the discovery of what this trumpet could be. I was listening to a teaching by the late Irvin Baxter of End Time Ministries, and he was talking about how he was in the midst of writing a book. It was in 1995. It was a day when he was behind on his deadline, and so he was kind of in the flow of it. His focus was on writing. He was typing away, and the Lord kept in bringing to his mind a rumor that he had heard that the word Chernobyl meant wormwood. So this is in 1995, only 9 years after the Chernobyl nuclear accident that happened in modern day Ukraine, then the Soviet Union. So he kept putting it out of his mind because he was focusing on writing, but he felt that the Lord was being quite persistent and he didn't want to be disobedient. So remember, this is 1995. So for those who are too young to relate to this time, there is no internet. There is no iPhone. He actually had to call the good old library and ask for the reference librarian. And he asked the reference librarian if she could look into this matter for him. Could she find out whether or not Chernobyl means wormwood in Russian? And the reference librarian told him she didn't need to look it up because she could confirm it right there on the phone for him. And she took him through an etymology lesson explaining the Russian, explaining how it's Chernobyl and all of these things. And he was astonished. And he said, I'm sorry, how do you know this off the top of your head? That doesn't seem like it's just common knowledge. And she said, oh, no, it's not. But I'm currently working on my doctorate in Russian. Think about that. The exact moment that the Lord is interrupting what he's committed to doing, which is writing a book, and the moment that he's pestering Irvin Baxter to call the library and investigate this rumor, is the exact moment that this librarian not only was on duty, but the one to answer the phone. And she could answer his question right off the top of her head because she happened to be getting her doctorate in Russian. I'm sorry, that's not common. Okay. I don't think it was any more common in 1995 as it was today. So to just randomly call the library at any given moment and reach a librarian who is in the midst of her doctorate in Russian can give you such a detailed answer, that has to be a divine appointment. So he decided that he wanted to write an article on this revelation, and he asked her if she could go ahead and pull some references for him. And she pulled him a book that was written by a scientist that survived the Chernobyl accident. She also pulled a documentary for him. And when he went and popped that VHS tape in the VCR and hit play, the name of the documentary was Chernobyl, The Bitter Taste of Wormwood. That's exactly what we just read in Revelation 8, right? That it was called wormwood, that the water became wormwood and was bitter to its taste. So, this is confirmation that Chernobyl means wormwood. Okay. Now, if you have not seen the HBO docu-series on the Chernobyl nuclear accident or incident, I don't know how, I mean, it wasn't on purpose, but it was an incident. It is exceptionally well done. And there is so much for us today to learn from what happened back in 1986. But what I want to do is just share with you a short little clip from, I believe it's the last episode And it's where the chief investigator is giving his report to a tribunal, a government tribunal, and he's explaining what happened. And what they do is, as he's describing it, they give a depiction, they play it out so you can actually see it. Now, what you're going to see is the lid on top of this nuclear reactor that has these cube looking pieces that are going to start hopping up and down. Each of those weighs 770 pounds. Okay. I believe that the whole lid like weighed somewhere near like 1,000,000 pounds or something like that. I mean, it's something crazy. And the fact that they're jumping up and down like that kind of shows you the pressure that was building in there. But I think it helps us to see a visual of what happened on this day, April 26, 1986, to see then how it compares to what scripture is describing. So what I'm going to do is share that video clip with you.
The pressure inside the core can no longer be held back. At long last, we have arrived. 1:23:45, explosion. In the instant the lid is thrown off the reactor, oxygen rushes in. It combines with hydrogen and superheated graphite. The chain of disaster is now complete.
So as you could see from where that clip left off, there and now I'm showing you a screen grab of another scene that showed people standing on a bridge after the explosion, seeing the same image. If this is what John saw in 90 AD, right? Remember, he is seeing things that are happening centuries, if not millennia, after his time. He has no reference for the technology that he is witnessing. So he's describing it the best that he can. And to me, it definitely looks like a star fell from heaven, blazing like a torch. That's what this image looks like. But also, if we are talking about the Chernobyl, the wormwood being Chernobyl, and we are relating that to the radioactivity, then that also is accurate because it blew up and then this fire kept spewing radioactive material into the sky, and this thing burned, I believe, for 10 days if I'm remembering correctly, and it spewed out 1,000,000 times the amount of radiation that would normally be found in the atmosphere, and it fell on the land. It contaminated vegetation, animals, it fell on water. And so all these things that we're talking about relating wormwood to Chernobyl and knowing that Chernobyl is this radioactive incident that contaminated and poisoned so much of the land around it, the people around it, but it also extended even into other places. And one of the ways in which Russia or the Soviet Union at the time got called out is that other countries started to detect this radiation and follow the weather patterns back to the Soviet Union. They did not confess to the world what had happened, right? They had to be called out. So that's the first part of the description that I think fits. But the rest of it also fits because it says that it fell, right, the star called wormwood, called Chernobyl, it fell on a third of the rivers and on the springs of water, and a third of the waters became wormwood, became radioactive, and many people died from the water because it had been made bitter or radioactive. Well, like I said, 1,000 times the normal radiation was released at Chernobyl, and it contaminated the water as well as the air, the land, all of that. So what I found in my research is that that included the Kiev Reservoir, okay, the Pripyat River, and the Dnieper River. Okay, those are the main rivers. Those are the main water sources for Ukraine. But it also seeped into the underground aquifers, which would be the springs of water. So yes, it fell on the rivers and it fell on springs of water. The explosion also triggered 5 days of radioactive rain that moved across Europe. They actually found radioactive fish in lakes in Germany and Scandinavia. And today there are still lakes that have no outward like streams, like so they're closed lakes. In Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine that still remain closed because they're still so contaminated with radiation. Okay, so when it talks about this star called wormwood, called Chernobyl, and it fell and it looked like a flaming torch and it fell on the rivers and it contaminated it and many people died, that fits perfectly with what happened on April 26th, 1986. Okay, so I'm hoping you're tracking with me, but I believe that was the third trumpet. I agree with what Irvin Baxter found out. And again, it's also quite compelling that the way in which he discovered it was such a divinely orchestrated contact with that particular librarian. Okay, so the next question then becomes, oh, let me, before I move on, actually, many people must believe this because here's the memorial that's over there that commemorates what happened in Chernobyl. I have a daytime photo on the left and an evening photo on the right, but it's an angel blowing a trumpet. So this is the memorial for Chernobyl, is an angel blowing a trumpet. So I'm not the only one. There are many people who are finding the connection, the similarity between the third trumpet and what happened in Chernobyl in 1986. Okay. So then the next question becomes, well, if that was the third trumpet and it blew in 1986, then what were the first two trumpets, because they would have come before that. So we're going to work our way backwards, okay? So the second trumpet is described in Revelation 8 verses 8 and 9. The second angel blew his trumpet, and something like a great mountain burning with fire was thrown into the sea, and a third of the sea became blood, a third of the living creatures in the sea died, a third of the ships were destroyed. So when Irvin Baxter was going through this same journey, going, okay, if that was the third trumpet, what was the second trumpet? Okay. What he suspected was that it was probably related to World War II. Because if you think about, again, John seeing a vision that of events that happened centuries, if not millennia later, right? What would look like a great mountain burning with fire being thrown into the sea? I believe it would be the atomic bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima and perhaps even including the one dropped on Nagasaki. Okay. Because does that not look like a mountain burning with fire? And when we look at where these are, yes, Japan's an island, but as you can see on the left, both of them are also specifically on the coast. And Hiroshima was dropped on, the bomb was dropped on August 6th, 1945. 3 days later, another was dropped on Nagasaki. Okay. So on the right is an image from Google Earth that I took myself because I heard that Hiroshima is actually a city built on the delta of the Ota River. And because it has so many fingers of streams coming off that river as it goes into the ocean, that Hiroshima is actually comprised of 6 islands divided up by these fingers of river. So again, when John is seeing this mountain burning with fire and he is saying, okay, it fell into the sea, that's what this looks like, because they're right there on the ocean, but also look at this water, it's falling on the water. Now what I could not verify is whether or not a third of the sea creatures were killed, because there was just no environmental impact studies that were done back then. But we do know that there was a lot of damage done to the reefs, as well as the sea life, not just by the atomic bombs, but just by other bombs that were dropped, particularly in the Pacific War between the US and Japan. They also had mines in the water that would go off and explode. You had submarines that, sunk, but also the ships that sunk, all releasing chemicals, oil. And so I could not verify that statistic. However, the statistic that we could verify was that a third of the ships were destroyed. Okay, so Irvin Baxter tells the story of sending his assistant, his secretary, to the library to investigate this, and she came back with these numbers. 105,127 ships participated in World War II. 36,387 ships sunk. So if you do the math, that's 35%, or one third of the ships destroyed. So what we can confirm is the mountain burning with fire falling into the sea. What we can confirm is a third of the ships being destroyed. What we can't confirm is the third of the sea turning to blood and the third of the living creatures living in the sea dying. However, there's a lot of evidence to show how John might have seen that. I just can't confirm the one-third statistic for those two parts, but we can confirm it on the part with the ships. I find that quite compelling. Okay, so we believe the second trumpet blew in 1945 when the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Okay, so if that's the second trumpet, then what's the first trumpet? Well, let's read about the first trumpet in Revelation 8:7. The first angel blew his trumpet, and there followed hail and fire mixed with blood, and these were thrown upon the earth. And a third of the earth was burned up, and a third of the trees were burned up, and all the green grass was burned up. Okay, so we're looking at two things: something that looks like hail and fire mixed with blood being thrown upon the earth, as well as a third of the earth, the trees, the green grass all being burned up. Okay, so we believe that that occurred in World War One. So what was unique about World War One is that this was the first war that had airplanes, because it was only about a decade prior that the Wright brothers achieved flight. So here we are now in 1914, and this is the first time that they had airplanes. Okay, this is also the first war in which they had tanks and heavy artillery. It is also the first war in which they had machine guns. So that's why if you look at these images from World War One, this is showing technology that was brand new to this war. And again, what did this look like to John in 90 AD? Okay, the painting that is in the top right, that was, you can see it's kind of like a tank upside down and burning, but also everything around it is burnt. And that painting is of Somme, France, because it was a target of the scorched earth policy. Okay, so let's look at the comparisons again. Hail and fire mixed with blood thrown upon the earth. I believe that that is what John, how he was describing all the new, the artillery that would be falling out of the sky. We see machine guns. We see airplanes for the first time. Okay, so that I believe that's what that is. But the earth and trees and grass being burned up, I couldn't find any statistics about what percentage of the land in Europe was destroyed by the scorched earth practices. So again, I can't confirm the one-third statistic specifically, but I can confirm that the earth and trees and green grass were burned up as part of the scorched earth practices that did take place in World War One. So some examples: the summer and fall of 1915, when Russia was retreating, they scorched 600 miles. Okay, so that's a lot of earth and trees and grass being burned. Excuse me. In late 1916, Britain burned the Romanian oil fields. And in 1917, Germany did a scorched earth retreat in Somme, France. That's that painting that I showed you. So again, I can't confirm exactly one-third. However, that sounds like a lot. Okay, that sounds like a lot being burned up. So that's why I find this to be a quite compelling evidence that the first trumpet sounded during World War One, which would be 1914 to 1918. Okay, so let's recap what we got. The first trumpet blew in World War One. Okay, 1914 to 1918. 25 years later, the second trumpet blew in World War Two. 41 years later, the third trumpet blew at Chernobyl. Okay, another thing I want to point out is that the Lord did not cause these events. All of these events were man-made disasters or man-made destruction. So the trumpets blowing did not cause them, but the trumpets blowing, I believe, identified them as key prophetic events that help us to orient ourselves on the timeline of the end of days. So when we see the trumpet blowing, it's announcing that something significant is happening and we need to pay attention. Now, I don't know if there was an actual trumpet, which, let me share, is a shofar, by the way. So when they say trumpet, they mean shofar. So I don't know if there was actually something in the natural that anyone would have heard where a shofar was being blown in the heavens or the heavenlies, to indicate that these events were significant prophetic events, or if it was something that was happening in the spiritual realm, in the unseen realm, that was signaling to the supernatural realm what was happening. Another idea that somebody shared with me is that the Bible talks about prophetic voices also being God's trumpets. So if we go back, I'm sure we can find prophetic people who were issuing warnings about each of these events. That could have also been the way in which the trumpets were blown. So there could have been an actual shofar blown. I don't know if anybody heard it in the natural, but it was definitely would have been heard in the spiritual realm, or right, it could be both. It could also have been pointing out the prophetic voices that were warning, because anytime in the Old Testament that the prophetic voices are giving warning, it is an opportunity for people to change course before destruction or disaster comes. So if we had prophetic voices at the time, which I'm sure we did, that was warning, right, that destruction's coming, disaster's coming, but yet people continued forward on that path, and we ended up seeing these events transpire. Okay, so those are the first three trumpets. Now, in order to understand the fourth trumpet, I actually have to go to the fifth trumpet. So we'll go to the fifth trumpet and then we'll go back and we'll talk about the fourth trumpet. All right, so whereas the first three trumpets only got a verse or two, this trumpet gets like 12 verses. So let's read them all and then I'll break it down. All right, so starting in Revelation 9, verse 1. And the fifth angel blew his trumpet, and I saw a star fallen from heaven to earth, and he was given the key to the shaft of the bottomless pit. He opened the shaft of the bottomless pit, and from the shaft rose smoke, like the smoke of a great furnace, and the sun and the air were darkened with smoke from the shaft. Then from the smoke came locusts on the earth, and they were given power like the power of scorpions of the earth. They were told not to harm the grass of the earth or any green plant or any tree, but only those people who do not have the seal of God on their foreheads. They were allowed to torment them for 5 months, but not to kill them. And their torment was like the torment of a scorpion when it stings someone. And in those days, people will seek death and will not find it. They will long to die, but death will flee from them. In appearance, the locusts were like horses prepared for battle. On their heads were what looked like crowns of gold. Their faces were like human faces, their hair like women's hair, and their teeth like lions' teeth. They had breastplates like breastplates of iron, and the noise of their wings was like the noise of many chariots with horses rushing into battle. They have tails and stings like scorpions, and their power to hurt people for 5 months is in their tails. They have as king over them the angel of the bottomless pit. His name in Hebrew is Abaddon, and in Greek he's called Apollyon. The first woe has passed. Behold, two woes are still to come. Okay, that's a lot. So let's break this down. So, first, let's talk about this fallen angel, because it says that he saw a star already fallen from heaven to earth. I believe that's talking about a fallen angel. So, we're talking about a principality, perhaps a territorial spirit over this region. Okay. And that angel is the one that is influencing what is happening in this event that is announced by the fifth trumpet. And it has something to do with this bottomless pit with fire and smoke, and it's so much smoke it's darkening the sky. But it goes on to say that the king over them, okay, that this angel is operating through, the agent or the vessel, okay, of this fallen angel, of this principality, is a king, okay, over this region. And his name in Hebrew is Abaddon, and in Greek it's Apollyon. Well, you can look it up for yourself in your Bible. I'm sure there's a footnote somewhere that tells you that it means destroyer. Okay. So the king that is being influenced, that is being either an agent or a vessel of this fallen angel, okay, is known as the destroyer. So that would be Abaddon in Hebrew, Apollyon in Greek, and Saddam in Arabic. Saddam Hussein was the king of Iraq. Okay. And what we're going to be describing as the fifth trumpet is when he invaded Kuwait and then set fire to the Kuwaiti oil fields. Okay. So when it says that his name means destroyer, I have screen grabs of an article that described why his mother named him that. It wasn't an accident. Okay. So she went through some horrific things when she was pregnant with him. Okay. So his father died in the fourth month of her pregnancy, they believe from cancer. Then, when she was in her final trimester, seventh or eighth month of pregnancy, his older brother died. Okay. Well, then she was so devastated, she tried to kill herself. And when that didn't work, she tried to abort him. Okay. And both times she was stopped by Jewish merchants who were family friends. So when he finally was born on April 28th, 1937, his mother shunned him, a sign of deep depression. Okay, so basically, her brother, his uncle, took him in. And then she showed back up when he was 3. So imagine that, like being all that's going on during the pregnancy that he's absorbing, but then also the rejection, right? She tried to kill him twice, first by killing herself and then by aborting him. And then when he's born, she shuns him for 3 years. Okay, so think about just psychologically, emotionally, just in the natural what that does to a person. Well, when she shows up and they're reunited when he's 3 years old, she's already remarried and she has more children, and the stepfather physically and psychologically abuses him. So we can already explain how he becomes the type of man that he becomes with natural explanations. But I also want to point out in the spiritual all the different ways in which rights were given to enemy spirits to lay claim to him, and he was at some point became a willing participant to the point that that fallen angel, that principality, that territorial spirit could operate through him and bring the type of destruction and death that he did. Okay, so when we're looking at all of this, we can explain, wow, like this is how he became such an evil, do to a man to do such evil things, but we can explain it in the natural as well as in the spiritual. Okay. Now, the other thing about Saddam is that he was known for his obsession with Nebuchadnezzar. And in fact, he believed he was the reincarnation of Nebuchadnezzar, who was the king of Babylon. Well, ancient Babylon is modern day Iraq. Okay, so that's what he's thinking. He's thinking, I'm the king of Iraq, which is modern day Babylon. I must be the reincarnation of Nebuchadnezzar, who was the king of ancient Babylon. Now, if you look, though, the piece that's missing is Kuwait. And that's what he ends up invading and then ultimately setting fire to their oil fields. Okay, so isn't that fascinating? So we have a region, okay, where the king is named Destroyer. His name is Saddam, who thought he was the reincarnated Nebuchadnezzar because Iraq is the same land as ancient Babylon, okay, and he invades Kuwait, right? So what he does though is he ends up setting fire to hundreds and hundreds of Kuwaiti oil wells. This article says 550, but I heard it was over 700. But what it's saying is it may take a year or longer because this article is from March 6, 1991, just a couple of months after Saddam set fire to the oil wells in January 1991. And so it's saying at that point, maybe they could only put out 150 of them, and it's going to take a year longer to extinguish the rest. But I just wanted to show you this article from 1991 showing what happened, okay? And you can see that it speaks of how much oil was set on fire, okay? It's literally going up in smoke, okay? But I also have this image of what it looked like. And so it was a 60-kilometer wide plume of smoke. And for 3 months, it burned so much that it blotted out the sun. And there are images you can find online that show what it was like in that area at noontime when it should be bright and sunny. And instead, the smoke was so thick, it did darken the sky. So when we look at that, okay, so far we're tracking that we have this man, the king named Destroyer, who's operating as an agent or a vessel of this fallen angel, okay, and it says that out of the smoke came locusts. Okay. They were given power like the power of scorpions. So he's trying to compare, again, modern technology to what he would be familiar with. And he would be familiar with locusts, which again would be also a biblical term for like soldiers, because if you read Joel, the book of Joel, it also uses locusts to talk about soldiers. But he's also trying to compare it to scorpions and scorpions stinging, right? But what's interesting is it says they were told not to harm and not to kill, right? But they were allowed to torment for 5 months. That corresponds with the operation that started in August of 1990 called Desert Shield. And so you can see I have a screen grab there of an article that talks about Desert Shield, and it points to August 9th, 1990 as the time when this started. And it says the gears of a massive US deployment that continued for more than 5 months, known as Operation Desert Shield, began to turn. Okay, so what was this operation? So for 5 months, Desert Shield, they were not allowed to kill. They were not allowed to harm the people or the land. What Desert Shield was a 5 month psyop. Okay, so it started out with them building up their forces in Saudi Arabia, but I have another document to share with you that is the introduction of a book that talks about the PSYOP that took place. Okay, this portion, this intro is written by the Colonel of Special Forces, Leighton G. Dunbar, and what he talks about is the leaflets that were released. Okay, and it was meant to be, like I said, a psyop, but it says that these leaflets were distributed, okay, plus they also had radio that was happening, the voice of the Gulf, and over 29 million leaflets were disseminated between December 30th, 1990 and February 28th, 1991. Okay, so the PSYOP, Desert Shield, it began with them building up forces. Then they had this PSYOP radio network that was playing. Then they went and dropped 29 million leaflets. Okay. And what I heard is that 87,000 Iraqi soldiers surrendered, many of them holding the leaflet in their hand when they surrendered. Okay. So when we look at, okay, so what are these locusts then? Because if these locusts are coming and they're coming out of the smoke, right? That's how John saw them, and they're told that they can torment for 5 months but not kill, or all of this is lining up so far with the Gulf War, right? I believe the locusts were John's description of military helicopters. Okay, so think about it. He's comparing them to horses because back in 90 AD, that's what they had. They had horses and chariots. Okay, but today we use military helicopters and planes and vehicles and tanks and things like that, right? But he compares it to locusts because locusts could fly. So he sees it in the sky, locusts flying. Well, then it would have to be a plane or a helicopter. And I think a helicopter fits the description better. Okay. So remember what it says, that it's got crowns of gold, humans like faces like human faces, meaning he could see the humans inside the cockpit. Okay. Hair, whatever he's considering hair, looks like women's hair, which would be long, right? Teeth like lion's teeth, breastplates like breastplates of iron, the noise of their wings. Think about helicopter wings. And he's comparing the noise of many chariots with horses rushing into battle. I mean, that's a pretty good description if you've ever heard a loud helicopter, a big helicopter. Okay. So here's a side by side of a locust in an Apache helicopter. And Apache helicopters were one of the main military helicopters that were used in the Gulf War in 1990, 1991. And so if we look at that, okay, like there's a thing on the top that could be a crown. I don't know exactly what part John would be comparing to woman's hair, but he can see the man in the cockpit. That would be the human face, right? The breastplate, which on a locust is the chest, the underbelly. And so that's the underbelly, right? And the wings sounding like the many chariots, okay? And it stings like a scorpion. I mean, look at the guns that are on that thing, okay? But it also said that during those 5 months, the power was in the tail. So I'm wondering if that's where the leaflets came out, that as they were flying, however they were distributing the leaflets, that's what it looked like, is that it was coming out the back of the plane because it was those leaflets that were causing the torment, right? Because they weren't shooting, they weren't doing anything with weapons in those 5 months. The weapons were all psychological. Okay. And so when it says then from the smoke came locusts on the earth, and they were given power like the power of scorpions of the earth. Isn't that what that looks like? Okay. So I believe that it's quite compelling to say, the evidence is quite compelling that we can confidently say that the fifth trumpet sounded in 1990, 1991. Okay. So looking at that, saying, okay, so the king of this region was the destroyer, and what he was doing brought locusts that then tormented them, okay, for 5 months. So that's what I believe the fifth trumpet was. So if that's the fifth trumpet, then what's the fourth trumpet? Because we're saying the third trumpet was Chernobyl in 1986, and the fifth trumpet is the Gulf War in 1990, 1991. So the fourth trumpet would have had to take place in that short span in between. Well, let's read what it says. Revelation 8, verse 12. The fourth angel blew his trumpet, and a third of the sun was struck, and a third of the moon, and a third of the stars, so that a third of their light might be darkened, and a third of the day might be kept from shining, and likewise a third of the night. So, what is this describing? I can't tell you exactly what it's describing. However, what the theory proposes is that this is John's way of describing time being shortened, whether it is literally time being sped up or the timeline being manipulated or sped up. Because when we're looking at the sun, the moon, the star, all of this being darkened, a third of the day might be kept from shining, a third of the night might be kept from shining. What we're looking at is, okay, so we can't point to a time when an event transpired that looked like that. However, there have been a lot of talk about time speeding up or about timelines being sped up, and that's what we believe this is describing. We believe the fourth trumpet is describing the days being shortened, like Jesus said in Matthew 24. He said, if those days had not been cut short, no human being would be saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. That's what we believe the fourth trumpet is, either time itself being sped up or the timeline being manipulated or sped up. So let me give you a couple of theories as far as when this happened or how this might have happened. The first is the Buckminster-Fuller knowledge doubling curve. Okay. What he found was that until 1990, human knowledge doubled every 100 to 125 years. So that's how long it took for human knowledge to double, about a century. But by the end of World War II in 1945, it was now doubling every 25 years. And by the 1980s, which is the time that we'd be looking for the fourth trumpet to blow, it was doubling every 13 months. We went in only 80 years from knowledge doubling every century to every 25 years to now every year, 13 months. And IBM at that time estimated that by 2020, it would be doubling every 12 hours. Now, I couldn't find anything that could confirm that IBM's estimate was correct. However, what I could find was that today, nanotechnology knowledge is doubling every 2 years. Clinical knowledge is doubling every 18 months. Average human knowledge is doubling every 13 months. And with AI, the doubling rate will continue to increase. So this could be a way in which time sped up. Okay. All right. That's not the only theory. I wonder about CERN. I don't know if you're aware of CERN. It is located near Geneva on the border of France and Switzerland, which is a key location for a lot of things that are going to come in the end times. But they have been doing experiments there that I and many people believe is messing with time, is messing with timelines, is opening portals, is just causing some sketchy things to happen. Okay. Now, today they have a Large Hadron Collider, okay? And it was launched in 2010. And people, whistleblowers claim it opened portals. Now, if you go try to Google that, they have all these news articles out there denying it. Okay, so just it's up to you whether or not you believe mainstream media and the denials that are put out by the powers that be, or if you would believe whistleblowers who are running out of these experiments screaming, going, sketchy stuff is happening, weird stuff is happening, they're opening portals, things are coming out of them. Okay. So to me, what I find interesting is the Mandela effect and how this relates to what they've been doing at CERN with this Large Hadron Collider. And if you're not familiar with the Mandela effect, it is named after Nelson Mandela because when he was released from prison and all of that, people were like, wait a second, I thought he died. So you have a large portion of the population that remember him dying. Okay. And that's why it's called the Mandela effect, because that's not the only thing. There are a lot of people that remember various things differently than what the evidence today would show. Now, a lot of people will point to things like, was it Berenstain Bears or Berenstain Bears? Or people will point to the Fruit of the Loom logo and whether or not it had a cornucopia. Those are some common ones, but there's a lot out there actually. And for some people, they have very personal ones like things changing in their hometown, remembering things differently. And these aren't the ones I don't agree with as far as the Mandela effect are things like misremembering quotes from movies. Okay. Like a common one that people want to cite is Field of Dreams. If you build it, they will come, is what a lot of people remember, but it wasn't. If you build it, he will come, and it was his father. Right. So I just think that's misremembering, misquoting. But there are other things that are legitimate, like what is going on here. Right. And if you look online, whether on social media, if you look on Reddit threads about this, you will see people, and I don't know how many are joking, I don't know how many are serious. Honestly, when I say it to my husband, I'm only half joking, that we're from the different timeline, right? So when we see something like, I swear to you, Bob Barker died in the 1990s. I swear to you, he did. I remember watching like a tribute to him during one of my summer breaks, I think, when I was sitting there watching daytime TV, including The Price is Right. Like, I could have swore he died in the 1990s. I'm not the only one. Okay, so things like that, where stuff will happen, all of a sudden, there's a whole swath of the population going, No, that's not right." Okay? So people will jokingly say, "Okay, I must be from the other timeline." Well, when I investigated that, people who actually take this seriously, who believe that timelines changed, they point to it changing around 2012, only 2 or 3 years after the Large Hadron Collider got lit up and started doing these experiments. Okay. But that's 2010, 2012. That doesn't fit the timeline for the fourth trumpet. Well, they had experiments with a large electron positron collider that preceded the Large Hadron Collider. They actually launched that in 1989. And they ran the Large Electron Positron Collider from 1989 to 2000 when it was dismantled so that they could then build the Large Hadron Collider and turn that on in 2010. So the timeline could have been changed or affected time itself. Something happened, I believe, with this Large Hadron Collider. But also, if we're looking at something that preceded that, because the Mandela piece that was coined before 2010, It could have been the result of previous experiments manipulating time or the timeline starting in 1989. Okay. Well, something else happened in 1989. And I believe it was the culmination of a deal that the United States made with the devil. Okay. There is a video and that where it was the beginning of 2024, and Dr. Don Crum was sharing about Project Stargate. And he was talking about declassified material that you can go and Google right now and read for yourself. But what I found interesting was the reporting he gave of a conversation he had with a man who was present for the experiments. Okay. So he wasn't one of the ones involved in trying to remote view and astral project. He instead was part of the government overseeing the experiment. So, what Project Stargate was is the United States, they kept finding intelligence leaks happening and they couldn't figure out if it was spies, like what was Russia doing that they were able to gather this intel, because all of this was happening during the Cold War. Well, they discovered that Russia was doing experiments with psychics, people who could remote view or astral project. So America said, well, what Russia does or the Soviet Union does, we can do better. And so they launched Project Stargate, and they recruited people who had psychic abilities, and they also had them do remote viewing and astral projection. Okay. And what Dr. Crum reports is a 15% accuracy rate, success rate for what these people were able to remote view spy on, okay, what the Soviet Union was doing. Now, what this man that Dr. Crum spoke to, who at the time was not a believer, but in the moment Dr. Crum was talking to him in the 2000s, he was. And I believe this encounter probably led to his conversion to Christianity, because what he described to Dr. Crum was in December 1972, a principality physically manifested in the room, and they made a covenant with it. The covenant was that they gave rights to this principality to the United States in exchange for an advantage over the Soviet Union. Well, anytime there's a covenant, there's got to be a blood offering, a blood sacrifice. Well, 1 month later, in January 1973, Roe versus Wade was legalized abortion. So you have a principality, and they said it was 8 to 9 feet tall, that it was quite evil, quite scary, physically manifested in that room when they were doing these experiments. And they made a deal with it. They made a deal with the devil, right? Uh, that you can have rights to the United States if you give us an advantage over the Soviet Union. And they confirmed that covenant when they legalized abortion. And they have since murdered millions and millions of babies, which both principalities and demons prefer the blood sacrifice of innocence. So the principality made good on his end of the deal in 1989 when the Berlin Wall came down, ultimately leading to the collapse of the Soviet Union. So it is believed that the fourth trumpet sounded in 1989. And I don't know if it was solely the coming down of the Berlin Wall, which honestly opened up the doorway for the New World Order to come into power and start to get things ready for the beast kingdom that's coming, or if what's happening at CERN and that collider that they had in 1989 messing with actual time, leading to the Large Hadron Collider, which we really do believe has been messing with time. So that's the best explanation I have. Okay, is that the fourth trumpet sounded in 1989, and whether time physically sped up or the timeline got manipulated, that's what we believe is the fourth trumpet. Now, we may be completely wrong, okay, because this one is the hardest one to correspond to an event, because the description seems to be talking about time, and we can't necessarily point to an exact thing, but we have this evidence that shows, yeah, it seems like around 1989 things were happening, and that's the closest we got. Okay. Now, Somebody pointed out this, and I investigated it. I thought that, yeah, this might actually be worthwhile to share with you. Was the deal with the devil undone? Well, oral arguments on the Dobbs case that led to the reversal of Roe versus Wade, those oral arguments took place in December of 2021. So the justices all worked on drafting their opinions over the spring of 2022. That's when, if you remember, Justice Alito's was leaked in May. But the final decision wasn't officially released until June 24th, 2022. And that's when Roe versus Wade was overturned. And all of the states that had a kind of a trigger ready, many of those places, abortion was automatically illegal, right? So it's not illegal everywhere, but it definitely became illegal in many places. So the number of abortions, of those child sacrifices, has been disrupted. So what does that do to the covenant? Well, the covenant was, that we would have an advantage over the Soviet Union. Well, at the same time that oral arguments are being made in the Dobbs case, December 2021, Russia is making demands of NATO that they pull back from the Eastern Europe and that they forbid Ukraine from joining it. And the time and the months when the justices are drafting their opinions for this case, well, Russia is doing its initial invasion into Ukraine. Okay, so does that mean anything? I don't know. I just find that that's very interesting that the original covenant was sealed with Roe v. Wade coming into being, legalizing abortion, and then it resulted in Russia losing its dominance and breaking apart. And then here in the midst of Roe v. Wade being overturned, all of a sudden Russia is exerting itself and invading Ukraine. So I don't know. Again, these are just some interesting things. Okay. I hope you find them interesting too. Okay, so here's where we are. First trumpet, World War I in 1914, 1918. Second trumpet, World War II, the atomic bomb specifically, in 1945. The third trumpet, the Chernobyl nuclear explosion in 1986. The fourth trumpet, timeline sped up in 1989. The fifth trumpet, the Gulf War in 1990 and 1991. So what's next on the timeline would be the sixth trumpet war. Okay, so let's read about the sixth trumpet. Back to Revelation 9, starting in verse 13. Then the sixth angel blew his trumpet, and I heard a voice from the four horns of the golden altar before God, saying to the sixth angel who had the trumpet, release the four angels who are bound at the great river Euphrates. So the four angels who had been prepared for the hour, the day, the month, and the year were released to kill a third of mankind. The number of mounted troops was twice 10,000 times 10,000. I heard their number. If you do that math, it comes out to 200 million. Okay. So here's some questions. Are these God's angels? Right? It says that there are four angels who are bound who've been prepared for this moment. I don't believe they are God's angels because every other trumpet has announced a man made event, and all the other angels have been fallen angels. So the fact that they've been bound, I believe, means that they were held back from acting, that they were held back from moving forward on this event, okay, because it wasn't the right time yet. Okay, so God knows these things are going to happen, but He is the one who is allowing them to happen in a certain time, right? It has to be not out of time, it has to be in time. The other thing is are these angels really going to kill a third of all mankind on the earth? I don't believe so, because if you go back, all the other trumpets, that the consequences of them were limited to the region in which they took place, right? So the scorched earth of World War I, that was limited to Europe. Okay, the atomic bomb that happened in Japan. Chernobyl, that happened in Ukraine, right? And so if we look at that, I don't believe a third of all mankind in all the earth is going to be killed. And in fact, if a third of mankind is killed, if that actually is literal, it would apply to the region. Now, what region are we talking about? We're talking about the region of the Euphrates River. And if you look on that map, it starts at the Persian Gulf and it goes all the way up into Turkey and it flows through Iraq. Okay, but also flows through Syria, through Turkey, and there's just a lot of things that we know are taking place in that region. And to the east is Iran. Okay, so if we look at events, recent events, there's definitely signs we could be on the verge of the sixth trumpet war. I don't know. We'll have to wait and see. Okay. So the other thing we're given is the 200 million troops. Is that literal? I don't know. 10,000, the number 10,000 is often used in the Bible to indicate an innumerable amount of an innumerable amount of things. There we go. So 10,000 times 10,000, twice that. That could be John's way of just saying too many to count. Like the whole sky was filled with them, or the whole, like my whole vision was filled with them. So I don't know if it's literally going to be 200 million troops. There are those, including Irvin Baxter's ministry, which is now ran by his son-in-law, that they look at that as potentially being literal, saying, well, what armies would have 200 million troops? And they say it would be China, or it could be like the Muslims if they all band together. I question whether or not it's going to be literally 200 million. Okay. I also question if it's actually going to be individual troops, because the way that it's described, he says that I'm going to read it to you, but it says they have lions' heads, that they have serpent tails. I mean, like the way he's describing them, I wonder if he's not seeing drones. Okay. And we know that drones are already being used by military. We know Iran has sent drones to Israel. We know that China is building up a drone, like enough drones to have a drone army. So I don't know if what John saw was people, okay, meaning individual troops, or if what he saw was this technology that he couldn't otherwise describe, right? And we won't know until we can look back at events and say, yeah, I believe it was this war or this event that did result in massive casualties. I don't know if it'll be a literal third or not, because some of the previous trumpets we could confirm like a third of the ships being sunk, but some of them we couldn't confirm. So I don't know if that third is literal. It certainly could be, but also the number of troops, it could be literal, and it could be people. So it could really be 200 million individuals, or it could be too many to count, and it could be more describing technology. Okay. So here's what I mean by the description. And this is how I saw the horses in my vision and those who rode them. They wore breastplates the color of fire and of sapphire and of sulfur. And the heads of the horses were like lions' heads. Okay, so again, kind of picture the different ways drones look today. I'm wondering if there might be a drone that is part of this event that could be described as looking like a lion's head, right? Like something about it maybe looks like it has a mane on it or something. I don't know. Um, but it says that fire, smoke, and sulfur comes out of their mouths. Okay. And it says, by these three plagues, a third of mankind was killed by the fire, smoke, and sulfur coming out of their mouths. So the one third of people who will die, it's saying it's dying by fire, smoke, and sulfur coming out of the mouths of whatever these things are, whether it's drones or some other technology. And it says the power of the horses is in their mouths. That's where the fire, smoke, and sulfur is coming out, but also in their tails, for their tails are like serpents with heads, and by means of them they wound. Okay, so again, it's like I think they're describing a technology that doesn't exist yet, or just we haven't seen yet. But what does he mean by plagues? Okay. Well, in the Greek, it's plague, and it can be the definition from Strong's Concordance is a stroke, by implication, a wound, figuratively, a calamity. So if you look at other verses in the New Testament that use the word plague, We see it in the story of the Good Samaritan in Luke 10, when the man is beaten half to death, and then the Good Samaritan comes and helps him. Beaten is plage, so beaten half to death. Well, in 2 Corinthians 6:5, Paul is listing all these different things that he's had to endure, that the apostles have had to endure. And the list includes the word beatings, which is in Greek plage. And then he goes on in 2 Corinthians 11 to describe those beatings as being often near death. Okay. And again, plague. So it's not necessarily like, say, a virus or a plague like that, where we'll see it manifest as a health crisis. Okay, think about the plagues of Egypt around the time of Exodus. Not all of them were necessarily health issues like we would kind of think about a plague. It just means a calamity. Okay, and so it's saying by fire, smoke, and sulfur, by those three kind of calamities, right? Which can also, if it's applied to a human, be just described as beating, like they're taking a beating, right? Near death, or to that it says that's what it will kill people. Okay, but that's what it means. So don't get hung up by the word plague, that it means it's going to necessarily be like an ailment, an illness, a virus, something like that. Okay, the other thing I want to say about the fire, smoke, and sulfur, those three plague, okay? Sulfur can also be translated as brimstone. So you might have heard the saying fire and brimstone. That's what this is talking about. Brimstone is an archaic word for sulfur, okay? Now, what I found interesting is that fire, smoke, and sulfur, those are the descriptions of how God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. Okay, so if you go back and read the story in Genesis 19, God rains down from heaven above onto Sodom and Gomorrah sulfur and fire. And when Abraham goes to look on the valley of Sodom and Gomorrah, he sees so much smoke in the land, it looks like smoke of a furnace. And if you remember, that's how the fifth trumpet was describing the smoke of a furnace, that it was that's what darkened the sky, right? So we're talking about intense smoke. Okay, so what destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah? It was sulfur and fire coming out of the sky, consuming it in such a way that the smoke was looking like smoke from a furnace. So in that story, it was God bringing destruction. So could the sixth trumpet be the enemy counterfeiting that and using technology to bring fire and sulfur from the sky to rain down, to destroy, right? That's what's coming out of the quote unquote mouth, the front of whatever this device is, which again I think might be a drone. But also in the Greek, fire can be translated as lightning, and sulfur can also be translated as flashes, right? So think about flashes, right? So if we're thinking, okay, John is maybe what he's seeing, he's likening it to what's just what he knows happened to Sodom and Gomorrah, right? Whatever he's seeing, it's like that's what it looks like, right? It looks like fire and sulfur. It looks like lightning and flashes, and it's raining down from the sky, and it's producing all this smoke, and it's killing a third of the people. Okay, well, let's look at what's been going on lately. Here's an image. This is off CNN about what is happening in the skies over Israel and over Iran. Here's another one. Here's another image, and there's plenty of others if you want to go look for yourself. I try to use images with either permission or just like I'm sharing with you. I'm sharing their website with you. I'm not taking ownership of their image, but just looking and saying, doesn't this look like fire and sulfur, lightning and flashes coming down from the sky? Okay. So in this case, some of them are coming from drones, and some aren't. Some of this is the Iron Dome, which is them releasing rockets to intercept incoming things and make it explode in the air instead of landing on the ground. Okay. So that I believe is going to be the sixth trumpet. It's a war and it's coming. What about the seventh trumpet? Well, we have to jump all the way to Revelation 11:15 to read about the seventh trumpet. It says, then the seventh angel blew his trumpet, and there were loud voices in heaven saying, the kingdom of the world has become the kingdom of our Lord and of his Christ, and he shall reign forever and ever. Hallelujah. And the 24 elders who sit on their thrones before God fell on their faces and worshiped God, saying, we give thanks to you, Lord God Almighty, who is and who was, for you have taken your great power and begun to reign. So the seventh trumpet is the start of Jesus's kingdom on earth. The nations raged, but your wrath came, and the time for the dead to be judged, and for rewarding your servants, the prophets and saints, and those who fear your name, both small and great, and for destroying the destroyers of the earth. So go back to the lesson in which I talk about the day of the Lord and how it starts with Jesus's return, okay, and what will be Armageddon, which we'll talk about in a couple of lessons. And the bookend is going to be Judgment Day. So it's both. It's God, Jesus bringing God's wrath, okay, and Judgment Day. And that's what the 24 elders are praising the Lord, is that this, the seventh trumpet, is the day of the Lord, the start of the day of the Lord, which is going to start with Jesus coming and bringing wrath, and it's going to culminate in Judgment Day. But it says that with this trumpet in verse 19, God's temple in heaven was opened, and the ark of his covenant was seen within his temple. So remember what we talked about with the seals, that it talks about the sky being rolled up like a scroll, and there's not going to be a sun and a moon and stars anymore, that the sky is going to be rolled back like a scroll. Well, this is what goes along with that, that we'll be able to see into heaven, like whatever the veil is that separates us from the heavenly realm, the third heaven, that keeps us from being able to see it. I think it's going to be similar to like what we read with Ezekiel and Isaiah, who it says they looked up and they could see. So whatever that is, it's going to be pulled back. We're going to be able to see God's temple in heaven. But it also says that corresponding with that is going to be flashes of lightning, rumblings, peals of thunder, an earthquake. We've heard all of this before, okay? But they add a detail here about the seven trumpets, saying there's also going to be heavy hail. And we're going to see that repeated in the seventh vial or bowl of wrath when we get to that lesson. Okay, so stick with me. But like I said, Revelation is not written chronologically, okay? It is describing events taking place in different regions, different areas, but they all culminate to this moment, which is Jesus's return. So the seven seals, the seven trumpets, the seven vials or bowls, all of it culminates in Jesus's return, which he comes on the clouds, right? Raptures his church, then proceeds into Armageddon to bring God's wrath to the beast. Okay, so we'll keep talking about that as we continue our study through Revelation, but I just want to give you kind of that picture, that framework we're operating from. Okay, so if this is Jesus's second coming, Jesus coming in the clouds, like I said in Matthew 24, what does Jesus say? For as the lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven. The powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. Okay. Paul also says this in 1 Thessalonians 4:16, the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a cry of command, with the voice of an archangel, with the sound of the trumpet of God. Okay. We see it in 1 Corinthians 15 as well. We shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet. For the trumpet will sound, and the dead will be raised imperishable, and we shall be changed. So the seventh seal, which we studied before, then the angel took the censer and filled it with fire from the altar and threw it on the earth, and there were peals of thunder, rumblings, flashes of lightning, an earthquake. What we just studied, the seventh trumpet, then God's temple in heaven was opened, and the ark of the covenant was seen within his temple. There were flashes of lightning, rumblings, peals of thunder, an earthquake, and heavy hail. And what we'll read in a later lesson is the seventh vial or bowl, depending upon your translation. And there were flashes of lightning, rumblings, peals of thunder, a great earthquake, such as there had never been since man was on the earth. So great was that earthquake. and a great hailstones, there's the hail, about 100 pounds each fell from heaven on people. All of this, right, is all talking about the same moment when Jesus comes back on the clouds and gathers his elect to himself. This is not some secret event where Christians just disappear one day. Okay. This is all going to be quite visible, and it says it's going to be visible. Okay. So this is going to be, again, a post Great Tribulation, which is the wrath of Satan, pre God's wrath rapture. So I'm hoping by bringing this all together that you're seeing what scripture is describing as one picture, okay? And so I took this and I added it to the timeline we've been building this whole time, that I believe the first five trumpets have already blown. So that goes before the start of the final 7 years from Daniel. Now, when's the sixth trumpet war going to be? We don't know. It could be happening now or soon, and it could then culminate or lead to the peace agreement that is made that allows the Jews to rebuild the temple and resume animal sacrifices. Okay. Or it could come at some other point where we don't know exactly. We just know it's coming next. Okay. And then when it comes to the seventh trumpet, we know that that corresponds, like I said, with Jesus coming back. So the description of the things related to the rapture, Jesus's return on the clouds and the rapture of the church, that's all the seventh trumpet. And I showed you just now verses that all said at the trumpet, at the trumpet, at the final trumpet. Okay. Um, and so that also is leading up to then Armageddon, which again we see in the seventh seal. But that's where we see the thunder, the lightning, the earthquake, and then we also see that there's going to be hail as well. Okay, so there you go. That's a lot. I know it's a lot, and I know I went very fast. So please, like, go back, listen, pause, chew on this, okay? Because I do think it's quite compelling. I think it's at the very least interesting and insightful, because either those are the first five trumpets, they've already blown, and we're waiting for the sixth trumpet, or they are indicative of the next iteration of what kind of events we would be looking for to be the five trumpets if they have not yet blown. I'm pretty convinced that they've blown, but I'm also okay with being wrong. Okay. So again, like, I'm not presenting this to you as like a concrete hard facts, but instead just sharing these theories, sharing these thoughts, because I do think it's still helpful. I think it's still relevant. And I know that as I listen to the news, as I learn about events taking place in the Middle East, things that are involving Israel, I pay attention because I'm sitting here waiting for either other trumpets to blow, but honestly, I'm waiting for the sixth trumpet war to start. I'm waiting for a deal to be made to allow the Jews to rebuild an altar and start their animal sacrifices. Those are the two things I'm waiting for, because I don't know if the sixth trumpet war comes first and then they can build an altar, or if they come to some kind of temporary peace agreement now that allows them to do it, and then the sixth trumpet war breaks out, and maybe that is what allows the antichrist to then come to power and bring some kind of peace and all of that. I don't know yet. So we do know those are the two next events. We're just not sure which one comes first. So that's why we need to be awake and ready. We need to be paying attention. We need to be watching the news going, okay, this seems to be indicative of either a war building that would be World War III, that would result in like devastating losses, or we are going to have temporary peace, and we see the Jews start to rebuild some kind of temple structure. And I'll talk more about that in the next lesson when we talk about the false prophet. But that's what I want us to be paying attention to when it comes to current events and what's happening now, but also what's to come. Is you have a framework to map it onto. What are we waiting for? What are the next events in the timeline that leads up to the final 7 years and Jesus's return? And that's what I believe we're waiting for: the sixth trumpet war, and the Jews to rebuild some kind of temple structure, altar, and resume the animal sacrifices. We just don't know which one's going to come first, but we're watching for both. So I hope that that's interesting. I hope that that's edifying. And again, it's all about being awake and ready so we're not caught off guard, but also that we feel that sense of urgency to stay on mission, to share the gospel, to be discipling others, bringing them to Christ, but also helping them to be awake and ready too. So I look forward to seeing you next time. We're going to be talking about the Jewish remnant and the false prophet. I'll see you then.